Welcome to another episode between myself and notable 9/11 researcher podcaster Leonardo Salvaggio. Leo, a good afternoon, long time.
Yeah, a long time. Thanks for having me again. My pleasure, Adam. I was really looking forward to our next episode, and here we are.
Yes, and here we are indeed. In fact, we're going to be talking about the 1998 East Africa bombings, and this is actually the very first uh, physical attack of Al Qaeda against the United States. And of course, 1993 was considered the first terrorist attack on a target, which is the World Trade Center, but was not attributed to Bin Laden and Al Qaeda. In fact, it's attributed to Ramzi Youssef, who wasn't formally inducted into Al Qaeda, even though um, many other experts would actually say that that was Al Qaeda's first attack. But Ramzi Youssef never gave bayat, which is loyalty, swear in Arabic. But 98 is a different issue, and the 98 attacks. I remember it being a huge event because I had never seen a terrorist organization bomb an embassy before, and I was too young about the Khobar Towers and the barracks bombings in Beirut. But the embassy bombings, which happened on August 7th, 1998, comes at the heels of a declaration of war by Bin Laden in February 23rd of 1998. It was Al Quds Ali Rabi, which is a an Arabic London newspaper, that published a statement made by the World Islamic Front, which was the organization headed by Osama bin Laden and Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri and Rafai Taha of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. And what they did was they formed a group and they called it the case of the World Islamic Front for Jihad against the Jews and the Crusaders. I can't believe I said that straightforward, but they made a declaration which was published in Al Quds in London. And what it basically said was, and I'll quote you from the document itself, it said, quote, the ruling to kill the Americans and their allies, civilians and military, is an individual duty for every Muslim who could do it in any country in which it is possible to do it. In order to liberate the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Holy Mosque in Mecca from their grip, and in order for the armies to move out of the lands of Islam, defeated and unable to threaten any Muslim. This is in accordance with the words of Almighty Allah, and fight the pagans all together as they fight you all together, and fight them until there's no more tumult or oppression, and dare prevail against justice and faith in Allah, end quote. And this comes at the heels, Leo, of an earlier declaration made in 96 by Osama bin Laden and the World Islamic Front Union, which basically said to not kill civilians, but only kill military for their disrespect of Mecca and Medina, which Saudi Arabia stationed them for their military. And now here we have a second declaration that involved citizens. So this is the first declaration of war that was made by this terrorist organization, in which 2 years prior, the CIA basically made a virtual station made after, just specifically for Bin Laden, which was called the Bin Laden Issue Station, codenamed Malik Station, under Michael Scheuer, who was the chief of station. So here you have this declaration of war on the preface that it was the American military and their allies who are basically at war with the Muslim community, or the Muslim Ummah, as it's called. And this is the insult. And now we have to fight outside of our borders to get rid of all the Crusaders and the Jews out of the lands of Islam. And I think, in this case, Leo, the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which is a Egyptian group headed by a number of individuals, Rafai Taha, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, Muhammad ibn al-Faraj, who was killed, actually was hanged for the role in the Sadat assassination, and Khalid Ismambuli. These are the people that basically created the Takfiri war, right? In other words, there was two fronts that they wanted to bring about. One was called the near enemy, and one was called the far enemy, in which the near enemy approach was to defeat all the secular Arab governments, have them overthrown, in replace for Islamic governments for the Sharia. And then when that happens and they create their caliphate, which would take many years to do, Then they could go war against the far enemy. And what is the far enemy? The United States and the West. So bin Laden was pressed for time. And so he wanted to bring the fight out of the United States. He wanted the United States to go into what the Soviets did in Afghanistan, Leo. And so they bombed these two embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and in Kenya. And basically killed a bunch of people. I forgot how many people were killed. I think it was like 260 or 230 people. Don't quote me on the number, but a number of people in the hopes. And this is according to uh, Hamza bin Laden, Salim bin Laden, who later on would give an interview and said that um, they what bin Laden was hoping for under the Clinton administration was to have the United States go into Afghanistan and fight against the Taliban and Al Qaeda, but they didn't do that. And there was a lot of motivation and process and preparation before these attacks. And so this was a huge event. I mean, when this happened, and basically what came from it was basically a reputation for bin Laden and Al Qaeda. And that gave rise to bigger operations later on, in which we study, which is the 9/11 attacks. But yes, Leo, what are your thoughts on this particular subject itself? I mean, were you were old enough to remember these attacks? Were you?
Yeah, I was 20. So yeah, I do remember them. And so I think that maybe it's worth taking one step back and see what's the historical context in which this happened. So, as I usually do, let me recommend our viewers where to find more information in case they're interested. This is where we also got this information that we are conveying today. So, the 9/11 Commission report is always the first starting point. Then, the second one I would recommend is The Osama bin Laden I Know by Peter Bergen, which is biography of Osama bin Laden based on recollections of people who were around him, and The Looming Tower by Lawrence Wright. Unfortunately, I have the Italian edition here, but this is very famous and needs no introduction. And the fourth one would be Ghost Wars by Steve Cole, which I don't have on paper because I only have a Kindle version, therefore I have nothing to show. Before we get to it, I would like to specify something about what you said. You're totally correct when you say that the 1998 bombings were the first attacks actually carried out by Al-Qaeda operatives, because previously they were just either financier or co-plotters. And you also mentioned that the first attack against America in which Al-Qaeda played a role was the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and that's correct. But we have another attack carried out by Al-Qaeda in the United States before that, in which Al-Qaeda had a role, which is the murder of Rabbi Meir Kahane in 1991.
Yes.
Of course, the guy who carried that out was not an Al-Qaeda member, but Al-Qaeda had a role in financing and also supporting the guy afterwards by paying his lawyers. So it's just worth mentioning. I think that to understand these attacks that happened in 1998, we have to understand the historical context in which they happened. And probably we have to explain briefly what happened between 96 and 98. Because 96 was also an important year in the history of Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda moved back from Sudan to Afghanistan. And this is weird if we think about it, because they went far away from Africa, but still they were organizing a terrorist attack in Africa. And at the same time, in 1996, the CIA started the Alex Station, which was the station aimed at tracking down Osama bin Laden, which was, and the United States were starting around the same years to understand that this guy was not just a financier, but he was going to carry out attacks himself with his organization. And so around that period, the United States tried to make deals with Arab local warlords and also with the Taliban for handing over to them Osama bin Laden, and they promised in exchange, we'll try to help you out with your civil war. That did not happen. And so Osama bin Laden was still at large in Afghanistan in 1998 with this all happened. So what happened is that the CIA even created a plan to kidnap the guy. And they carried out a lot of tests, I think either 2, 3, or 4 in the United States because they were supposed to cooperate with Afghan mujahideens on the ground, and the United States was like kind of leading the operation. They rehearsed it a few times, but then they had to stop it because it was too risky, it was too difficult, it was not something that had a high chance of succeeding. Therefore, they left it to the side. And eventually, these attacks happened, and that changed the whole pictures. Therefore, kidnapping Osama bin Laden was not an option anymore. They wanted to kill him. And that's about it for the introduction. Should we go on discussing the attacks themselves?
Sure, itself. And one thing I'd like to add to that too is the timeline for the intelligence services in leading up to the attacks itself. So, um, in the many months prior to the attacks, and we were talking about this before we pressed record, there was an interview by ABC News John Miller, who was invited to a Bin Laden campout, and basically he was blindfolded along with his camera crew, and they were then sent inside a makeshift area where they interviewed Bin Laden. But the questions that John Miller had were translated to Bin Laden, but Bin Laden basically gave the answers in Arabic. But they couldn't. John Miller wasn't allowed to have the answers translated on the spot. Afterwards, Bin Laden, when they went back to New York and got the video translated, to Miller's horror, was that Bin Laden declared war on the United States, and right behind Bin Laden is a map of North Africa, South Africa, and behind him were the spots that he was going to bomb, which was Kenya, Tanzania, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, Kenya. And so the CIA, who had started becoming more familiar with Bin Laden and Al Qaeda way before the FBI and the State Department did, the NSA and the CIA have been bugging Bin Laden for years. And one person in particular was a London-based Al Qaeda affiliate named Al Fawaz. And Al Fawaz, Khalid Al Fawaz, who is a courier in London, who actually was getting orders to send satellite phones from the United States to Afghanistan so that Bin Laden and Al Qaeda, other Al Qaeda leaders, to basically talk on these phones. The FBI had found out, told the NSA about the phones. The NSA started decrypting the phones, in which the phones were already decrypted anyway. In other words, decryption meaning that there was no barrier to break. So they were actually getting information from these phones regarding phone numbers. And one phone number in particular that Bin Laden was calling was a house in Yemen, which we know as the Al Qaeda communications hub located in the capital of Sana'a, owned by an individual named Ahmed al-Hada, who just, by the way, happens to be the the father-in-law of a future 9/11 hijacker, Khalid al-Mihdhar, but that's neither here nor there. Fawaz and the London carriers basically were getting satellite phones for Bin Laden and his crew. NSA started tapping the phones. CIA began sending human contacts to follow in and out the whereabouts of where Al Fawaz was in London, and also to this house in Yemen. But what's interesting, Leo, is there was a person named Mustafa Mahmoud Saeed Ahmad who, in November of '97, and was part of this unit in Nairobi, in which the Al Qaeda cell was based in, regarding the embassy bombings, went into a US embassy there in Nairobi and began sharing details of this bombing plan to bomb US embassies in Africa. Now, the CIA went to interview him, and they couldn't corroborate his claims, but he was good enough to keep him on as somebody who has a source within it. But this information was never shared with any embassy in Africa. Now, later on, I forgot the woman's name who was a U.S. Diplomat that went to Africa and was there because information kept coming back to the CIA, Leo, about threats to the US Embassy in late 97, early 98. Then when the declaration of war happened, heightened tensions happened all over US embassies and US interests abroad, not inside the United States. So the State Department sent this woman, I forgot her name, forgive me, and she basically did security checks on the embassies, specifically in Kenya and Tanzania. And she says that we need to beef up security immediately because there was a lot of traffic in these areas. Trucks could get in. There's garages underneath, and there was a lot of worry and concern. But the United States never acted on this, and they basically deported this guy Mustafa Mahmoud Saeed Ahmad, I think to Egypt or somebody else. Oh, the woman's name is Prudence Bushnell. It came back to me, Prudence Bushnell. She's the U.S. Kenyan ambassador, and she sent like memos to the State Department about threats to the embassies. And so what happened was in May of '98, I don't know the date, but Clinton creates a national coordinator for counterterrorism. And who heads it? Richard Clarke. And so Richard Clarke is now in position to outline this very important presidential directive based on counterterrorism, in which would give rise to the rendition project. It didn't happen under Bush, it happened under Clinton, called the Presidential Decision Directive 62 or PDD 62, which outlines multiple areas of goals of fighting terrorism and strengthening interagency. And so bin Laden basically is now a person of concern and subject to this rendition program. So now the CIA, the NSA, Kenyan authorities, Egyptian authorities are all aware of bin Laden and the threats to U.S. interests abroad. But just like with 9/11, Leo, no stricter security measures are made. Nothing happens here. And this cell in Nairobi that exists, which is basically compromised by people like Saeed Ahmad, people that are, warning the United States about an impending attack, nothing happens. And Leo, we see this time and time again, especially with this situation and later on with 9/11. And it makes you really wonder. It gives you wonder and concern about, the rise of conspiracy theories. Maybe the intelligence service were on it, or that the intelligence services basically had so many warnings they don't know what to act on it. But you never really know about the true motivations or the lack of awareness by these intelligence services to act on it. But what are your thoughts on, like, why do you think they didn't basically act on the information, especially when you have contacts within Al Qaeda itself that basically are coming out and saying, hey, there's a threat to embassies abroad?
Well, you mentioned 9/11, but we can also mention the Boston bombing because the two guys were
Yes.
okay because the FBI was after them, but there was probably a problem with the transliteration of their names because I think that the information provided by the Russians spelled their last name starting with Z, while the American transliteration started with TS. I think that you're correct when you say that there was a problem with intelligence, but we also have to keep in mind that Al Qaeda started planning these attacks in 1993 with a makeshift laboratory that was tasked with surveilling the embassy in Nairobi to see what would have been the fastest way, the easiest way to carry out an attack like that. The fact that the attack happened 5 years after is also because investigators were after them. So again, I don't, because, okay, we know that they started like 5 years before, and there were a few things that happened in the meantime, which were Al Qaeda moving back to Afghanistan, and that's pretty easy and simple. If you're escaping, you cannot plan terrorist attacks. Okay, terrorists are just human beings. Okay, as me and you. If you're tasked with escaping, you cannot plan attacks. And at the same time, I think that one of the guys, I don't recall his name exactly, but his name is definitely mentioned in the 9/11 Commission report, handed himself over to Saudi investigators. And one of the reasons also why the attack was slowed down is that The UK and the USA were after them. Therefore, they have to move around and to escape and move from a place to another. That's why it took so long. And then after bin Laden in 98 issued his fatwa, as you mentioned before, they managed to carry out the attacks in August. So I get what you mean, but I don't want to end up playing the Monday morning quarterback because actually
Right.
investigators were after them and they did something. And let's not forget that investigators have to succeed 100% of times while terrorists only have to succeed once.
Yes, correct. And it's such a fine line, Leo, isn't it, in between, what conspiracy is and what the facts are. And it's very easy for one to believe that maybe the CIA wanted this to happen, maybe the NSA wanted, maybe the State Department wanted to happen. But I would happen to think that maybe an attack is coming and to not act on the information for the interests of certain people, not everybody, but maybe certain people, to basically allow for like the 9/11 attacks to happen so they can, go to war with Iraq and Afghanistan. But again, that's speculation because I don't have information that shows this, and I probably never will. Maybe there is information; it's out there. I don't know, but you're right in the instances that the terrorists don't have to think about that. They just have to be successful just one time, and that's it. There's no mistakes. But I mean, when you have like say the USS Cole bombing, they tried the first time and the boat sank because there was so many bombs on board the boat. The boat sank, and the ship they were going to attack initially was I forgot the USS was in the Millennium Plot. I forgot the name of the ship they were going to attack. But then, they reaffirmed a second attack, which was basically the USS Cole in October. But in this case, here you have this unit in Nairobi and another unit in Kenya. And then you have these groups that are basically coexisting under this operation. And there are certain elements within this operation that were fundamental to the operation itself. And one name we're very familiar with is Ali Muhammad. Ali Muhammad is initially charged for the embassy attack. Nobody, hardly everyone ever talks about this. Is that he's the one who went to Nairobi and Kenya, took pictures of the embassies, took pictures of the security apparatuses, went back to Bin Laden. And then that information was sent to these units, these people that were involved with the bombing of the embassies. Now, Ali Muhammad was then forced out back to the United States because Al Qaeda's military commander, Mohammed Atef, or his real name is Abu Hafs al-Masri, didn't trust Ali Muhammad, thought he was a spy. And so bin Laden liked Ali Muhammad, gave him his passport. He went back to San Francisco. And then we all know the story there. He gets arrested later on. The Egyptian Islamic Jihad in August joins Al Qaeda and issues a statement about these arrests that were made in Albania called I think it was called I forgot the name of the case actually. They charged Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri in absentia. I think they wanted him for the death penalty or something like that for some reasons. Anyway, the operators in Nairobi and Kenya now are just days away, and so they stay at these hotels and these safe houses, and then these groups basically are led by a number of operators. So you have the martyrdom drivers, and then you have these passengers that are basically going to come out and start attacking the security apparatus, and the truck goes through into the garages, and then they self-detonate. Now, one member named Muhammad al-Ohali, actually his role, now this is disputed, his role was to basically, he was going to survive and basically attack the guards and then run away. Now, al-Ohali, now in some disputes, he was supposed to be killed, but then something happened, and then he grabbed a gun, he grabbed the gun and started shooting at the guard. He ran away. Then the truck couldn't get in and detonated, and that was in the I want to say that was the Kenyan embassy. and the driver was a Saudi, and his name was Muhammad al-Harazi, actually, or he was known by his code name in the unit called Azam. And he drove. He couldn't get through the barracks. He couldn't get into the garage, and he detonated, and it blew up. But because he blew up and detonated, Al Holly was running away, and the shrapnel hit him in his back and through his coat. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this because it's very important because Al Holly goes to the hospital, and the news gets out that there was a bombing. And when the hospital staff look at Al Holly, he's got like little dots of shrapnel all over his back, his coat's, shredded. So they look at him and they go, this guy looks like he came from the bombing. So what did Al Holly do? So the security guards at the hospital watch him. And so he's using a payphone outside the hospital. Who is he calling? Well, they gave him a phone number to call in case he survived. And because he survived, the phone number he called, Leo, was the house in Yemen. The FBI found out because the hospital staff called the security services. Security services called the FBI. They go and interview Al Holly. And I forgot. Maybe you can correct me, Leo. Was it Clunan or I forgot this guy's name. The FBI guy that goes and interviews him, Antisev, John Antisev, I think, goes and interviews Al Holly.
I don't recall, Adam. I trust your memory.
I think it was John Antisev. Yeah, it was John Antisev. And he goes and interviews him. And he says, look, we know you're with the bombing. We just want to know, who you're calling. And he gave him the number. But what John Antisev had no idea was that the number was already known to the NSA and the CIA because they were monitoring it since 96. Yeah. Here we are in 98. And so they're actually investigating the case. So they bring Al Holly back. They start interviewing him. He tells them everything about, the units that were in Nairobi, the units with Kenya, who was the drivers, who was involved, and stuff like this. And the FBI thinks they struck a gold mine and shared this information with the CIA, but not knowing that the CIA already had this information about the house in Sana'a, Yemen, about monitoring them through signals intelligence and human intelligence, because they didn't want to compromise their operation, which was basically later on amended to using Saudi intelligence inside the United States to monitor two people that were inside the house, Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, who were known al-Qaeda operatives, because the Saudi government told the United States about these two and to be on the lookout for them. And the CIA and the NSA started monitoring them. And now the operation is much bigger. But unbeknown to the FBI, they had more information than they provide. Meanwhile, the FBI is sharing this information with the CIA. And the CIA then started gaining more information because they're using the FBI at this point for additional information that they didn't have regarding the embassy bombing. So the CIA sent the Special Activities Division. The FBI sent, their investigative team over to Africa and started, finding out about this cell in Kenya and about al-Qaeda bin Laden. Now the threat's huge. And so Al Holly is telling investigators about where he hears a conversation between Abdul Rahim al-Nashiri discussing attacks on U.S. warships in the port of Aden in Yemen, and to do this with rocket-propelled grenades and missiles. And Al Holly was staying at a guest house. I have to be remiss. I have to bring this up because it's important, because Al Holly is staying at a guest house with none other than Tawfiq bin Atash, or Tawfiq bin Khalad, or known as Khalad. And that he was also involved with the embassy attacks, and that he knew Al Holly because they were staying at a guest house for like 3 days or something like that. So with all this information now, this goes right to the State Department, Leo. And here comes the response. And so, Leo, what was that response?
So what happened is that on August 20th of the same year, the U.S. carried out 2 bombings from ships. So not with the Air Force, but from ships in the sea, of course, with cruise missiles. And so they bombed 4 Al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan in a place called Kandahar. And Osama bin Laden was supposed to be there. So this is actually an assassination attempt on Osama bin Laden. Of course, we know that he managed to escape. And actually, the reason why is conflicting because if we read what Steve Cole wrote in his book Ghost Wars, he said that they had a meeting in that place on that day, but it finished early. Therefore, Osama bin Laden was able to escape. If you read an article on the Washington Post by former director Bill Gertz, he says that that meeting on that day was canceled. We'll never know for sure, probably. And actually, this is a very small detail. So, to be honest with you, nobody cares. And so, what happened is that Osama bin Laden managed to escape. And the funny thing is that Al Qaeda said that they had 6 casualties, while the international reports say that there were 30 casualties. So it's fun how we have conflicting reports here as well, and that Al Qaeda is trying to scale down the impact of this attack. At the same time, the US does something pretty strange. So they bomb a pharmaceutical plant in Sudan because they said that this plant was not producing medicines, but they were producing chemical weapons for Al Qaeda. And this is weird, okay, because this attacks is not being carried out with chemical weapons, but with traditional bombs. So why bomb this plant? It doesn't make any sense. The result of it is that Sudan had a problem with availability of medications for a while. Therefore, we have a big damage on the civil population for a long period. And the year after, the Bureau of Intelligence and Research carried out an investigation according to which this pharmaceutical plant had nothing to do with Al Qaeda and was not working with them at all. And so why that happened, I think this is just speculation here, but I think that probably President Clinton was so distracted with his scandal with Monica Lewinsky that he had to show off himself as a powerful person, as a man in charge, and he wanted to show the world that he was still in control of the nation, that he was a strong man with drive. Being Italian, I have to admit that I totally don't care about what Mr. Clinton did privately in his private time with this girl. It's none of my business. And even if I were American, I would say that's none of my business as long as he is a good president. I mean, I would judge politicians based on what they do at their work and not in their private time. But I understand that there was a big controversy. He was in the news every day for this scandal, therefore, has probably lost control of what he was doing. And let's not forget that presidents, even the presidents of the United States, are human beings, and they have some of the same problems and doubts and things of the sort that we all have. And the next thing that comes to my mind is that bombing Iraq in 2003 was probably also a rough decision, a rushed decision by President Bush because he was frustrated by the fact that he could not kill Osama bin Laden on time. Therefore, I think that let's go back to what we're discussing. I think that the bombing of the plant in Sudan was a terrible mistake because President Clinton had some distraction and was not reasoning right.
Yeah, and on top of this, you have a CIA that's basically reforming under its newly minted director, George Tenet, the DCI, and basically reformatted how the CIA was perceived by the public. So there was a lot of pressure under Clinton to basically keep under wraps the CIA, make sure that it goes by the directives of the earlier church committee hearings, and that they don't do anything illegal. Now, what's funny is that the CIA basically can't do anything that's really legal because most of the things that they do, especially when it comes to geopolitics, is based on the legality. I mean, they're known as the shadow company to begin with. I mean, the same, and they're not a judicial entity. People tend to forget they don't do arrests. They collect information. You have people like analysts and officers. They're not agents. They're not people that have any type of authority when it comes to uh, prosecution or arresting people. On top of on top of this, you have a State Department that basically is led by this progressive in Clinton, and then you have this mounting shadow group that operated out of the Reagan administration that was given some type of influence under the Bush senior administration, and they're called the neoconservatives. And people that basically have intentions of going to war with Arab countries, specifically Iraq. People like Richard Pearl and Douglas Feith and Louis Libby and Paul Wolfowitz. These are the people that came under the Paul Nietzsche school under neoconservatism. Clinton was seen as an innovator. And at the time, I remember specifically, it was probably the best economic rise of the United States in some time. And we basically were enjoying relative peace during that moment. What we didn't realize was that there was a storm brewing. And that storm was coming from bin Laden and Al Qaeda. And, bin Laden didn't just wake up one day, Leo, and said, well, I'm going to become a terrorist. A lot of people don't realize bin Laden actually was a well-educated student, very quiet, practiced judoka, was very shy, and was under the influence of his father, who was a multi-millionaire, billionaire, actually, Mohammed bin Laden, who is the largest construction company in Arabia called the Saudi bin Laden. And then when his father died, bin Laden basically was affected by that and looked up to his brother Salim bin Laden until he died. Now, how did both of those people die? Incidentally enough, they both died in plane crashes. Looming foreshadowing, isn't it, Leo? I mean, that's interesting. But the embassy bombings were basically a test by bin Laden to see how the United States would react. And one of the very good things that Bill Clinton did was what you just elucidated just now, a tentative proposal to strike. Now, there was a plan that you brought up. The CIA wanted to assassinate bin Laden, but Clinton threw cold water on that because they were involved with a group of Yemenis that were, falcon hunting, and bin Laden was a big falcon hunter. They didn't want to kill him right there. And the drone strike program was just started. And the CIA basically said that we're not an assassination team, believe it or not. Remember the church committee hearings, like I said, put the restraints on them. And the Pentagon said, we're not doing that. And so there was a big clusterfuck, Leo, regarding what action to take against bin Laden. And this gave rise to bin Laden and terrorist attacks in the future. And bin Laden saw them as weak because of this. And, very few people brought this up, one of them being geopolitical expert Scott Horton, basically talks about it. Paul Thompson does talk about it. Very few people talk about it. But bin Laden saw this as a strength of the weakness of the United States, in so much that the terrorist groups in Egypt, in Algeria, in the Philippines, and Indonesia said, my God, we could strike the United States and they're not going to do anything about it. So what they did was they started working with Al Qaeda. They didn't group together with Al Qaeda. So they started working like groups like Abu Sayyaf and Jemaah Islamiyah, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, worked with bin Laden and said that we'll send recruits over to you. And according to Ann Sterrington in a fantastic book, Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, she said that during the period after the embassy bombings, the Al Qaeda saw a rise of foreign jihadists from all over the world to camps like Al Farouk and Karnak Farms and other areas in Afghanistan that saw the numbers grow from like 50 to like 300, 400 people, and they started giving these courses in how to enact on guerrilla warfare, how to build bombs and whatnot. And right during this time, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed visits none other than Mohammed Atef, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, and Osama bin Laden about a bigger proposal. and that is the planes operation. And we talk about this in previous episodes before, so please watch that. So, Leo, you know, what are your thoughts regarding the lack of a response to bin Laden? Do you feel that the Clinton administration was weak? Did you feel that the intelligence services didn't want responsibility for killing, innocent people because they're under such restrictions? So, what are your thoughts about this lack of a response, in opposed to, what the responses were?
Well, I think that this topic is so long and complex that we could go on talking about this for hours. So let me summarize.
True.
Yeah, I think that this is one of those situations in which whatever you do, you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't.
Mm,
Because
mm,
of
mm,
course, Clinton by carried out that assassination attempt, tried to, kill the innocent people who were living in Afghanistan, but what was he going to do? I mean, he had no other options, really. I'm not sure if the case was that the US were weak in their response, therefore, this led Osama bin Laden to carrying out 9/11 because he did not fear the reaction in that case. I think that the reaction by the states in 98 was strong enough. And we also said that they even probably overshoot by bombing a plant in Sudan that had nothing to do with Al Qaeda. I think that Osama bin Laden's way of reasoning is totally different from mine or yours. Therefore, he actually
mm.
did not care about the response because he knew that he was going to die. And he knew that the United States would have overthrown the Taliban. But did he really care? Because I think that, I mean, these guys are martyrs. Well, no, martyrs is totally something else. Let me rephrase it. I mean, these guys are ready to die for their ideals. So I don't think that he really cared. And we could say that, okay, he sent others to die, he didn't go himself. But still, the mindset is that your ideal is so strong that you're ready to die for it. And moreover, I think that the power that Osama bin Laden was taking from his disciples was that they were kind of worshiping him. So to carry out such a big attack on the United States made him appear as their hero. And being worshipped in that way was what was giving him power. This is just speculation, but I think that it makes sense because everybody in the world, at the end of the day, likes being liked. So
Let
long
me
story
bend
short,
your
I think long story
Yeah.
short, I think that the reaction in 98 was correct, was fine, but there's no way to stop someone who wants to do that.
Let me bend your ear on this and get your thoughts right away. And this is armchair quarterbacking, so take it where it leads. Right? Did When Prudence Bushnell warned the United States about attacks on embassies and the lack of security, uh, did you find it concerning at all that this is just like with 9/11, when there was a threat to airline industries in the months leading up to 9/11, even the years prior to 9/11, that the again, bureaucracy works slow, that they maybe didn't want to spend money to where they thought that, bin Laden is not a threat, and why are we spending money here? Do you think that was the case, or basically, or again, entertaining conspiracy? Maybe, just maybe, they wanted the attacks to happen. What is the more realistic approach here?
I think that nobody wanted that to happen, at least in the United States. I will rule out that 100%. I think that what happened was that lack of coordination between agencies
Hmm.
and intelligence mistakes because humans make mistakes. Okay, so we have already discussed about intelligence being ignored. We have lots of cases. We have the FBI memo blocked at the Alex station. We have the Phoenix memo, and we have all the things going on. But at the same time, keep in mind that, and you said it better than I did at the beginning of this video, what Al Qaeda did was kind of new because they what they did was totally different that was totally different from what Hamas does or what Hezbollah does. They are a new way of terrorism. And moreover, if someone had said in year 2000, Al Qaeda is going to strike the World Trade Center, security would have been put on the ground. and planes would have been coming from the air.
Mm.
So I think that it's a combination of human mistakes and the new way of doing things.
And just to end it on that note, the Southern District of New York actually brings back Muhammad Dawood al-Ohali and others like Wadi al-Hajj, who we failed to mention was the main contact and financier involving the Kenyan operation, and another individual named Mohammed Sadiq Ode, involved with the procuring of the weapons that was used in the trucks that was used for the bombings themselves. They were all prosecuted and given life sentences for, I think it was, they were indicted for nearly 300 charges by the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York. And they were all given life sentences, actually. I think Wadi al-Hajj is inside, um, uh, was brought back to the United States. In fact, he wasn't brought back to the United States. It's a funny story, just to add. Wadi al-Hajj actually was married, and he had a residency in Houston, Texas. And somehow he went back to the United States, knowing full well that the FBI wanted to arrest him. Stupid enough, he went back and he was actually prosecuted for his role in the '98 bombings, which he claims that he was innocent. He had no idea. But meanwhile, he went to his house in Africa, which Bin Laden gave him to run the financing of the embassy bombings themselves. And they saw these books and transactions and whatnot. They linked the attacks to him. Mary Jo White, at the time, was the U.S. District Attorney for Southern New York, prosecuted everybody, got everybody arrested, whatnot. But they made the same mistake again later. Just like with 93, after they captured, Ramzi Youssef and Mohammed Salameh and Abdul Yassin. I'm sorry, Yassin was in Iraq, and the others. And they made the mistake of going on TV and saying, "Oh, that's it. There's no other people inside the United States. The threat is over." Mary Jo White wasn't as robust in her declaration for that, but basically said that we got everybody. But what they didn't realize was that there were other people out there. And these people were unknown to the Southern District of New York, unknown to the State Department. And these are the people that are very rarely known at the time. In fact, the only people that knew about these people were the CIA and an FBI agent by the name of Frank Pellegrino. And his name was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And for those who are followers of Leo and myself, this individual would become the forefront, even more so than Bin Laden, because here's a guy that has his hands in not just the 9/11 plot, but also with 93, the Pachinko plot, which gave rise to the 9/11 plot, and other future operations, and was a much more nefarious figure in terms of global threat than Bin Laden was. Bin Laden basically was this mysterious figure and had influence and money. But Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was the brains of terrorist operations. And we'll talk about him specifically in future videos because I find him to be a fascinating, mysterious figure, more so than Bin Laden actually, and has a history with nefarious underground groups, especially in Pakistan and even with Saudi intelligence. That goes, and that's not a conspiracy because they found that out about Ramzi Youssef himself. But Leo, last words, last thoughts regarding the embassy bombings themselves. So we know about the failures of the intelligence services or the lack of a reaction, so to speak. We know about the weak response by the U.S. Department. What would you now? This is armchair quarterbacking, but what would have been your response to the embassy bombings themselves had you been in a position of power, like say Clinton?
Wow, that's the hardest question ever. I would probably have done the first half,
Yeah.
bombing Al Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan as they did with the information I had in mind back then at that time, and that's it.
Would and what are your parting thoughts about the Africa bombings? How are they important to the lead up to 9/11?
Oh, they're very important because they show again a new way of doing terrorism, and of course, it explains a lot of the history of Al Qaeda. what they
Hmm.
were up to, what they were trying to conceive, because this is the first attack that they carried out themselves. And let me add something. So you know that I started 19 years ago covering 9/11, and the first things that I was doing together with a group of friends was debunking conspiracy theories, which I left alone after a while because it gets boring.
Hmm.
I mean, if you consider all the history of Al Qaeda, conspiracy theories just collapse. I mean,
Hmm.
Al Qaeda is real, okay? It's not something made up. Al Qaeda is real, and it was something that was carrying out attacks in the 90s as well. It's not something that popped up in the news in 2001. So, your question here uh, gives me the opportunity to once again underline that conspiracy theories are basically ignorant people, because if you study the history of Al Qaeda was pre-existent to 9/11. Therefore, you cannot say that it's something that no one has heard of before that date.
Yeah. Now let me also piggyback on that, what you just said regarding conspiracy. Now, I'm somebody who sometimes bring up conspiracy, but I also tend to differentiate. What you're talking about is fringe conspiracy, or as I call the fantastical. And with 9/11, my God, I have yourself, you longer than I have, regarding the miraculous claims of, like, hologram planes, or the hijackers are alive, or that Judy Wood's space beams melted the towers and whatnot. Every miraculous fringe conspiracy that they would rather believe than just the plain obvious. Hey, Al Qaeda hijacked planes and crashed them into the World Trade Center, Pentagon, and in a field in Shanksville. But does that mean that there wasn't a conspiracy? Yeah, there were conspiracies, but they're involving the intelligence services and the lack of coordination between the agencies for whatever reason. Now, that's the thing we're missing, specifics, right? We got everything basically covered, but the specifics of what led up to the attacks, not everything is public. And of course, for national security, and also to protect people like the CIA and the Saudi intelligence, because they were running an illegal operation inside the United States and monitoring Khalid al-Mihdhar Abavi. That's a conspiracy. But the conspiracies that are basically myself and what you are engaging with on a daily basis, unfortunately, are the fringe material, which basically is given um, carte blanche and also way too much attention. And it kills me because basically, channels like yourself, Leo, now, because you're here, are sorely ignored on the large public because of people like Christopher Bolin and Rebecca Wood. They get all the attention, Alex Jones and Jim Fetzer. And meanwhile, Leo, you've been around a long time. And I think you're the one who deserves 1 million followers,
Thank
because
you.
you can provide information. But no, laugh all you want, because there are people out there that are still getting attention, like, Richard Gage and whatnot. I mean, there's not many left because, like I said, all these fringe conspiracy theorists have like a shelf life of 5 years before they become boring because they don't learn anything new. And so that's the difference between actual researchers like yourself and people like the fringe conspiracy theorists. And what I want to, say right off the bat, that we're not basically saying that there aren't conspiracies. There are, but they entail, actual people and actual information that weren't shared, that, allow for these attacks to be successful. And like you just said earlier, which is important, the terrorists don't have to be right just one time, and
Yeah.
that's it. They could have, the CIA and the FBI, the NSA, whatever, in Israel or Saudi Arabia intelligence, they can make all the mistakes they want, and for whatever reason. But the terrorists just had to be successful just one time to affect what they're trying to affect. And so, Leo, I'll give you the last thoughts and regarding any type of work you're working on. What are you doing, and what you would like to see in the future?
Well, I just made a video on my YouTube channel with an FBI former agent by the name of Chris Anglin, who was involved in
Yes.
JTTFs before and after 9/11, and he was also deployed to Guantanamo. And we talk about the interrogations there and what information they got from there. And probably my next video about 9/11 will be again about Guantanamo again.
Guantanamo. And incidentally enough, Guantanamo is back in the forefront again, but this time it's not going to be with Arab terrorists. It's actually going to be with illegal immigrants and immigrants in general. And the stories I'm hearing are similar to what I heard back in 2010. And that's something that we got to talk about maybe in the future. All right, guys. Listen, Leo, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you again for doing this. And hopefully now in the future we'll be doing this on the more regular. I'm back full time, so we'll be back pumping out more videos in the future. Thank you guys for coming in. Leo, have a great rest of your day.
See you next time.